Mary Dalton buried her husband at noon. By midnight, a stranger was pounding on her door demanding she become a wife again before sunrise. Jonathan Hale didn't ask. He didn't explain. He just said the words that would change everything, and Mary, still in her mourning black, answered with a condition no man in Virginia expected from a woman with nothing left to lose. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from ashes, this story is for you. Subscribe. Follow this journey to the very end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The knock came like a fist against a coffin lid. Mary Dalton did not move from her chair. She had buried Thomas that afternoon, dirt still fresh under her fingernails, from where she'd knelt at the grave and refused the shovel the Reverend offered her. She had wanted to do it herself. The last thing she could do for him. The knock came again, harder. "Go away," she said, not loud enough for anyone to hear through the door, but loud enough to remind herself she still had a voice. The door didn't wait for permission. It opened because in a town like this, doors belonged more to desperation than to manners, and the man standing in the frame looked like a man who had run out of every manner he'd ever owned. Mrs. Dalton. She looked up. Jonathan Hale. She knew the name the way everyone in the county knew it, the largest tobacco planter this side of the James River, a man who did not visit widows on the night of their husband's funeral, a man who did not visit anyone at all if he could help it. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you have picked a poor night." "I know it." "Then you'll forgive me if I don't offer you tea." He stepped inside without being asked. Rain had soaked through his coat, though it hadn't rained in 3 days, and Mary realized after a moment that it wasn't rain at all. It was sweat. The man had ridden hard. "I need a wife," he said. "By tomorrow morning." Mary did not laugh, though something in her chest wanted to. She had heard many strange things in her life. She had heard her mother scream when the fever took her sister. She had heard Thomas's last breath rattle out of him, like a door closing on a room she'd never enter again. But she had never heard a man announce a need for a wife, the way another man might announce a need for a horse. "I buried my husband 4 hours ago," she said. "I know that too. Then you'll understand if I find your timing peculiar. I don't have the luxury of peculiar, Mrs. Dalton. I have until sunrise." She set down the shawl she'd been folding, the one Thomas used to wrap around her shoulders in winter, the one she would now fold for no one. She studied Jonathan Hale the way she used to study a ledger before she signed it, looking for the number that didn't add up the debt hidden beneath the total. "Sit down," she said. "Or don't. But stop dripping on my floor and tell me why a man like you is asking a woman like me for anything at all." He sat. His hands, she noticed, would not stay still. Big hands, a planter's hands that had probably never shaken in his life until tonight. "My daughter hasn't spoken a word in 6 months," he said. Mary's spine straightened. Her mother died in the spring, fever, same as half the county lost someone to. Anna was in the room when it happened. She saw it. She saw all of it. And since that day she hasn't said a single word to me or to anyone. "That's a grief a father should tend to himself," Mary said. "Not solve with a wedding license." "I agree with you." "Then why are you here?" His jaw worked before the words came. "Because my late wife's brother Whitmore has filed papers with the county court. He says a widower with no woman in the house is unfit to raise a child alone. He says Anna needs a mother's hand, and since I don't have one to offer her, he intends to take her before the circuit judge arrives Thursday. Take her. Take her. Raise her himself. His wife already has the nursery prepared from what I'm told." Mary felt something cold move through her, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin or the dead fire in the grate. She had taught school for 6 years before she married Thomas. She had seen children pulled from homes before, watched families torn apart over land and money dressed up as concern. "And you believe marrying a stranger by morning will stop him? The law says a child needs a woman in the household to be considered properly raised. If I have a wife by the time the judge arrives, Whitmore has no case." "So I am not a wife you're asking for," Mary said slowly. "I am a shield." Jonathan didn't flinch from that. She gave him credit for that much. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what you'd be. The fire popped once in the grate, though there was barely enough left to pop. Mary looked toward the window, toward the dark, where Thomas's grave sat fresh and cooling, under a sky that didn't care about either of their tragedies. "Why me?" she asked. "There must be 40 women in this county who'd marry a man with your land before the rooster crows twice." "Because they'd marry me for the land," Jonathan said. "You just buried a man you loved. You have no reason to want anything from me except what I can offer honestly, which is protection and nothing more. I need someone who won't mistake this arrangement for romance. I need someone who understands a contract when she sees one." Mary almost smiled. Almost. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her like she had sense instead of feelings. "You've thought this through," she said. "I've had 4 hours to think of nothing else." "And your daughter? Does she know you're out here proposing to a widow at midnight?" "No." "Does she know anything is happening at all?" Jonathan's hands finally went still, folding together like a man in prayer, though Mary doubted he'd prayed in some time. "She knows Whitmore comes to the house more than he used to. She knows her aunt looks at her like she's already theirs. Children know more than we credit them for Mrs. Dalton. I imagine she knows something is wrong. She just doesn't have the words for it, or won't use them." Something in Mary's chest cracked, quiet and private. The same crack that had opened the day she watched her sister's coffin lowered, and understood for the first time that the world did not owe children their innocence for as long as they needed it. "I won't do it for land," she said. "I won't do it for your name, or your house, or whatever comfort you imagine comes with it." "Then why would you do it at all?" "Because somewhere in this county tonight, there's a 6-year-old girl who watched her mother die and hasn't said a word since, and a man is trying to take her away from the only parent she has left because it's convenient for his ledger. I've seen that story before, Mr. Hale. I taught children whose families were broken apart for less noble reasons than concern. I didn't like the ending then, and I don't intend to like it now." Jonathan looked at her like a man who hadn't expected to be seen clearly. Not tonight, not by a stranger in mourning, black with dirt still under her nails. "Then you'll marry me." "I said I have conditions before I said I'd marry you. Don't confuse the two." "Name them." Mary stood. She walked to the window, the one that looked out over the small patch of earth where Thomas now rested, and she did not turn around when she spoke, because some things were easier said to the dark than to a man's face. "First, I will not force that child to call me anything. Not mother, not mama, not anything she isn't ready to give. If she wants to call me nothing at all for the rest of her life, that will be her right, and you will not push her." "Agreed." "Second, this marriage will exist on paper and nowhere else. I will not pretend affection I don't feel, and I will not perform a romance for the benefit of your household staff or your neighbors. We will be partners in this arrangement, nothing more, unless something more grows between us honestly, which I do not expect, and you should not either." "Agreed." "Third." She turned now, and her eyes had the particular steadiness of a woman who had already lost everything once and had nothing left to fear losing again. "Whatever happens between us, whatever comes of this arrangement, the custody of that child is not negotiable. Not to Whitmore, not to anyone. If you ever for any reason allow that man to take her, this marriage ends the same hour, and I will testify against you myself." Jonathan stood slowly like a man absorbing a blow he'd been expecting, but that still landed hard. "You'd testify against the husband who saved you from being a penniless widow." "I'd testify against any man who let a frightened child be handed off like unwanted livestock, husband or not." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, an owl called once, twice, and fell silent. "Then we understand each other," Jonathan said finally. "We understand the terms," Mary corrected. "Whether we understand each other remains to be seen." He extended his hand the way men did over cattle deals and land sales, and Mary looked at it for a long moment before she took it. His grip was firm but careful, like a man handling something he suspected might break, though whether he meant her or the arrangement itself she couldn't say. "The circuit judge arrives Thursday afternoon," Jonathan said. "The Reverend can marry us tomorrow if we ride to his house at first light. It won't be much of a ceremony." "I didn't come to you looking for one," Mary said. "I came to you 4 hours a widow, Mr. Hale. Don't mistake my agreement for eagerness." "I wouldn't dream of it." She almost believed him. He left before dawn, broke fully riding back toward Hale Land with the same urgency he'd arrived with, and Mary stood in the doorway of the cabin she and Thomas had shared for 3 years, watching the dust settle behind his horse, wondering if she'd just agreed to save a child, or ruin herself trying. She didn't sleep. There wasn't time. And even if there had been sleep, had abandoned her the same day Thomas's cough turned to blood and never turned back. She packed what little she owned into a single trunk, her mother's Bible. 3 dresses, a locket with no picture in it because she'd never had one made, and Thomas's pocket watch which had stopped the exact hour he died, and which she hadn't had the heart to wind again. The Reverend's house sat at the edge of town, a modest structure with a garden gone slightly wild from a summer of neglect, and when Mary arrived just past sunrise, Jonathan was already waiting outside, it pacing a small trench into the dirt path. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there the night before. Relief, maybe, or simple surprise that a woman had kept her word. "I don't make agreements I don't intend to honor," Mary said. "Whatever else you learn about me, Mr. Hale, learn that first." Reverend Coyle met them at the door in his nightshirt, still having clearly been roused from sleep by Jonathan's insistent knocking some time before dawn. And he looked between the two of them with the particular expression of a man who had married enough desperate couples in his career to know better than to ask questions. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss, truly." "Thank you, Reverend. And you understand what you're asking me to do here today. Marry a woman not 24 hours widowed." "I understand it well enough," Mary said. "The Lord judges hearts, not calendars, and mine has been settled on this decision since before I left my door this morning." The Reverend looked at Jonathan next, and something passed between the two men that Mary couldn't read, some history of favors owed or debts still standing, and then he sighed and stepped back to let them inside. 10 minutes, he said. "I won't drag out what neither of you came here to enjoy." It took less than that. There were no flowers, no witnesses beyond the Reverend's wife, who stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, with an expression Mary couldn't quite name. Not judgment exactly, but something close to it, softened by pity. There was no music. There was a Bible worn soft at the corners, and there were 2 people standing before it who had known each other less than a full turn of the sun. "Do you, Jonathan Hale, take this woman?" "I do." The Reverend's eyebrows lifted slightly at the speed of the answer, but he continued. "And do you, Mary Dalton, take this man?" Mary looked at Jonathan. Really looked at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to in the dim light of her cabin the night before. He was younger than she'd expected, though grief had aged him the way it aged everyone. Eventually carved lines into a face that might have been handsome, once might still be handsome if exhaustion ever loosened its grip on it. His eyes were the color of strong tea, and they held hers with a steadiness that surprised her. "I do," she said. "But hear me clearly, Reverend, and let it be known before God and this room. I do not promise this man love. I have loved once, and I buried it yesterday. What I promise is presence. I will stay. I will not abandon the task I've agreed to. That is the whole of my vow, and I'll not pretend to more." The Reverend's wife made a small sound in the doorway, something caught between a gasp and a sob. But Jonathan did not look away from Mary's face. "Then that is more than I deserve," he said quietly, "and more than I expected to receive from anyone again." The Reverend, perhaps sensing that further ceremony would only stretch an already strange mourning thinner, pronounced them married with considerably less flourish than the occasion typically demanded. And within the hour, Mary Dalton. Now Mary Hale, though the name sat strange on her tongue, was riding beside a man she'd known less than a full day, toward a house she'd never seen, to meet a child who hadn't spoken in 6 months. The Hale property announced itself before the house did. Fields of tobacco stretching wide and green on either side of the road, tended by hands that moved with the practiced rhythm of long labor. And Mary understood then just how much land, how much wealth sat behind the desperate man who'd knocked on her door at midnight. It should have comforted her. Instead, it unsettled her further, the vastness of what she'd married into the smallness of what she'd brought with her: one trunk, a stopped watch, a locket with nothing in it. The house itself rose up white and columned at the end of a long drive, grander than anything Mary had lived in since she was a girl, before her father's debts had taken the family home and scattered them into smaller and smaller houses, until the smallest one of all became the cabin she'd shared with Thomas. A woman stood on the porch as they approached, older, sharp-eyed, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and Jonathan's shoulders tightened slightly at the sight of her. "That's Prudence," he said. "She's kept this house since before Eleanor died. She won't be pleased about this." "I don't require her pleasure," Mary said. "Only her cooperation." "You may not get either." Prudence's expression when they dismounted confirmed it. She looked Mary over the way one might inspect a horse being sold under suspicious circumstances, taking in the plain black morning dress, the trunk that clearly held more grief than possessions, and her mouth pressed into a thin line that required no words to translate. "Mr. Hale," she said, "a word if I might." "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my wife." The word wife landed strange in the morning air, and Prudence's eyebrows rose at the speed with which it had apparently become true. "Married already? Well." She looked at Mary again, longer this time. "And does Miss Anna know she has a new mother waiting inside?" "She is not to be called that," Mary said before Jonathan could answer. "Not mother. Not by anyone in this house, unless the child herself chooses it, which she has every right never to do." Prudence blinked, clearly unprepared for a bride with conditions of her own. "As you say," she said slowly, and something in her tone suggested she was recalculating her assumptions about the woman standing in her employer's dooryard. "Where is she?" Mary asked. "In the back garden. She spends most mornings there, sitting near her mother's roses. Doesn't touch them, just sits." Mary nodded, and without waiting for an invitation from either Jonathan or the housekeeper, walked around the side of the great house toward the garden. Because she had learned long ago in her years teaching that the moment you asked a frightened child's permission to approach, you'd already lost the chance to reach them naturally. The garden was modest compared to the house, roses climbing a trellis gone slightly unkempt from a summer without its usual keeper. And there, on a small stone bench beneath them, sat a girl small enough to seem lost inside her own dress. Dark hair pulled back in a braid, someone else had clearly tied, for her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Mary did not approach directly. She sat instead on the low garden wall a fair distance away, close enough to be present, far enough to not crowd, and she said nothing at all. For a long while, simply existing in the same space as the child. The way she used to sit with the quietest students in her old schoolroom, the ones grief or fear had silenced before their letters ever fully formed. Anna did not look at her, but she did not leave either, and Mary counted that as the first small victory of a day that had already asked more of her than most weeks of her life combined. "I used to have a rose garden," Mary said finally, to no one in particular, to the air, to the flowers, to whoever might be listening. "Before I married the first time. My mother grew them, yellow ones mostly. She said yellow roses meant friendship, not love, and she thought friendship lasted longer." Anna's eyes flicked toward her just briefly, just once, and then returned to the middle distance. "I don't expect you to speak to me," Mary continued, still not looking directly at the child, still keeping her voice low and even, the voice she'd used on frightened 8-year-olds who'd lost fathers to the war, or mothers to fever. The voice that promised nothing and demanded nothing in return. "I'm not here to make you speak. I'm not here to replace anyone, or fix anything, or ask you to feel something you don't feel yet. I'm only here because your father needed help, and because 6 months of silence after losing your mama sounds like the loneliest thing in the world, and I know something about being lonely." Silence stretched between them, broken only by a mockingbird somewhere in the higher branches, running through its stolen repertoire of other birds' songs. "My husband died yesterday," Mary said. "I buried him in the afternoon and married your father before the sun came up today, which I imagine sounds like the strangest thing you've ever heard a grown woman admit to a child. But I tell you, because I think you deserve honesty more than most people get, especially now, especially after everything you've already lost." Anna's small hand resting on the stone bench curled slightly, fingers pressing into the rough surface. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Mary said. "Trust is earned, not given, and I intend to earn it slowly, the same way I'd earn anything worth having. I only ask that you let me sit near you sometimes. That's all. Just sit." The mockingbird finished its song and started another. The roses swayed slightly in a breeze that carried the smell of tobacco fields and distant rain. Anna did not speak. But when Mary finally rose to leave her to her silence, the girl's eyes followed her the entire way back to the house. And something about that, the watching, the quiet, careful attention, told Mary more than words could have. The child was listening. Somewhere beneath 6 months of silence, she was listening to every word. Inside, Jonathan was waiting in what appeared to be his study, standing at the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of a man bracing for news he didn't want. "Well?" he asked when Mary entered. She didn't speak. "I told you she wouldn't. I didn't expect her to. Not today. Perhaps not this month." Mary set her trunk down beside the door, a small gesture that nonetheless felt enormous, the physical claiming of space in a house that wasn't hers yet and might never fully be. "But she watched me the entire time. She listened to everything I said, even when she pretended not to. That's not nothing, Mr. Hale. That's the beginning of something." "Jonathan," he said, "if we're to share a name, you might as well use the one I answer to." "Jonathan, then." She tested the name the way she'd tested the ring he'd produced from somewhere that morning, plain gold, clearly not his late wife's, clearly purchased or borrowed in haste. "And you'll call me Mary, not wife, not Mrs. Hale, except in front of Whitmore and anyone else who needs the fiction maintained." "Agreed. I'll need to know more about her. Anna. What she was like before. What frightens her. What comforted her, if anything still does." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Mary thought he might refuse the question entirely, retreat behind the same wall of grief that so many men she'd known retreated behind when asked to speak plainly about their pain. "She used to sing," he said instead, quietly. "Before. Eleanor taught her hymns, and Anna would sing them off-key in the mornings while Prudence made breakfast, and it drove the dogs half mad with howling, and Eleanor would laugh until she cried." He stopped, started again. "She hasn't sung since, hasn't hummed, hasn't made a sound beyond breathing as far as I can tell in 6 months. And you? How have you been with her these 6 months?" "Poorly," Jonathan admitted, and the honesty of it surprised Mary more than anything else he'd said since midnight. "I don't know how to reach a child who won't reach back. I bought her things. Dolls, ribbons, a pony she's never once ridden. I thought perhaps things would say what I couldn't find words for myself. They didn't help. They just sit in her room untouched, gathering dust like everything else in that child's life since May." Mary considered him for a long moment, the tired planes of his face, the hands still faintly trembling from either sleeplessness or something closer to grief he hadn't allowed himself to fully feel yet. "You cannot buy your way into a child's trust," she said. "You can only stay long enough for her to believe you won't leave. That's the only currency that matters to a heart that's already been broken once." "And how long is long enough?" "I don't know," Mary admitted. "I've never done this before. I've taught other people's children their letters and their sums. But I've never tried to teach a frightened girl that the world hasn't finished taking things from her." She paused. "But I intend to find out, starting today." A knock interrupted them. Prudence, standing in the doorway with an expression that suggested trouble, had arrived before its usual hour. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Mr. Whitmore's carriage is coming up the drive." Jonathan's entire posture changed, the exhausted honesty of moments before hardening back into the desperate urgency that had driven him to Mary's door the night before. "He's early," he said. "The judge doesn't arrive until Thursday. Perhaps he's come to see for himself whether the rumors are true." Mary said, already smoothing the front of her morning dress, straightening her spine the way she'd once straightened it before facing a room full of unruly students on their worst day. Perhaps he's heard already that you found yourself a wife overnight, and he's come to see if it's true, or if it's only talk. Mary, let him come, she said. I didn't marry you to hide from your family, Jonathan. I married you to stand in front of that child and refuse to move. If Mr. Whitmore has come to test whether I mean it, then let's not disappoint him. She walked toward the front of the house without waiting to see if Jonathan followed her, spine straight, her borrowed ring catching the morning light, a widow of 1 day and a wife of 2 hours, walking toward a fight she had chosen with both eyes open. Because somewhere behind her, in a garden full of untouched roses, a 6-year-old girl had listened to every word she'd said. And Mary Hale did not intend to become one more person who left her. Whitmore's carriage came to a stop at the base of the porch steps with the kind of deliberate slowness that told Mary the man driving it wanted every eye in the yard on him before his boots ever touched ground. He was tall, narrow through the shoulders, dressed finer than a man visiting family had any right to be. And when he stepped down, he did not look at Jonathan first. He looked at Mary. "So the rumors are true," he said. "Depends which rumors you've heard," Mary said. "I find rumors travel faster than facts in this county and arrive considerably more dressed up." Whitmore's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I heard my brother-in-law married a widow he met yesterday. I heard the ceremony took less time than it takes to shoe a horse." 10 minutes if you're counting, Mary said. "Reverend Coyle can confirm the number if precision matters to you." "It matters a great deal, Mrs. Hale. The court cares for precision. The court will want to know whether this marriage was made in good faith, or whether it was assembled overnight for the sole purpose of obstructing a legitimate custody claim." Jonathan stepped forward, but Mary raised a hand slightly, not touching him, just enough motion to still him where he stood. "Let me understand you correctly, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "You believe a woman cannot grieve her husband in the morning and choose to protect a child by evening. You believe those two things cannot exist in the same day, in the same heart. I believe convenient timing deserves scrutiny." "Then scrutinize it," Mary said. "I welcome it. I have nothing to hide and less to lose. I buried a husband yesterday, Mr. Whitmore. I have already survived my worst day. Whatever you intend to throw at me will have to stand in a very long line." Whitmore's eyes narrowed, recalculating the way men often did when a woman failed to shrink the way they expected. "You don't know this family," he said. "You don't know this child. You've been in this house less than an hour, and already you speak as though you belong here." "I speak as though I intend to stay," Mary said. "There's a difference, though I understand it might look the same to a man measuring things only by title and land. This isn't about land, isn't it?" Mary tilted her head slightly, studying him, the way she used to study a boy in her classroom who insisted he hadn't cheated on his sums while the evidence sat wet in his own handwriting. "Forgive me, Mr. Whitmore, but a man rarely rides out this early in the morning over pure concern for a child he sees, once a month, twice. There's usually a ledger somewhere beneath the sentiment." Something flickered across Whitmore's face there, and gone so fast that Jonathan, standing rigid beside her, seemed to miss it entirely. But Mary did not miss it. She had spent 6 years reading the faces of children who lied about broken slates and missing lunch pails, and an adult's guilt looked no different, only better dressed. "You overstep," Whitmore said. "Perhaps," Mary said. "But I notice you didn't deny it." The silence that followed had weight to it. The kind of silence that arrives right before something shifts, and Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying an edge Mary hadn't heard in him yet. "Say what you came to say, Whitmore. My wife has had a long day, and it started before dawn." "I came to see Anna." "She's in the garden," Mary said before Jonathan could answer. "And she stays there, undisturbed. I am her uncle." "You are a man who frightens her," Mary said, and she said it plainly without cruelty, the way she might have stated a fact about the weather. "I don't know what history stands between you and this family, Mr. Whitmore, and today I don't care to learn it. What I do know is that a child who hasn't spoken in 6 months does not need to be paraded in front of a courtroom or interrogated in her own garden by a man whose interest in her well-being conveniently coincides with a filed custody claim. You have no right to keep me from her." "I have every right," Mary said. I am her father's wife, and until a judge tells me otherwise, that makes her welfare partly my concern, and I intend to guard it the way I'd guard my own child, which is to say fiercely and without apology." Whitmore looked between Mary and Jonathan, something calculating behind his eyes, and then he laughed short and humorless. "You picked well, Jonathan," he said. "A woman with a spine. I'll give you that much credit. It won't matter Thursday, but I'll give you the credit." "Thursday will decide what it decides," Mary said. "Until then, I'd ask you to leave. Not because you're unwelcome as a man, but because your presence unsettles a child who has enough to carry without your carriage wheels announcing themselves in her yard." For a moment, Mary thought he might argue further, might plant his boots and insist on his rights as blood family, but something in her steadiness seemed to unbalance him, and after a long measuring look, he turned back toward his carriage. "Thursday," he said again, as though repeating it might make it land harder. "The judge won't be as easily managed as you seem to think, Mrs. Hale." "I don't intend to manage him," Mary said. "I intend to tell him the truth. I find the truth tends to manage itself when a person isn't busy hiding something inside it." Whitmore's jaw tightened, and without another word he climbed back into his carriage and rode off the way he'd come, the wheels kicking up dust that drifted slow and lazy across the yard, settling over everything like an unanswered question. Jonathan exhaled long and shaking the breath of a man who had been holding something in his chest since midnight and had only now allowed himself to release a fraction of it. "You handled him better than I have in 6 months," he said. "I've had practice with men who think confidence is the same thing as truth," Mary said. "It rarely is. He'll come back. I know. He'll bring lawyers next time. Papers. Things I can't argue against with words alone." Mary turned to face him fully now, and something in her expression had hardened the softness she'd shown Anna in the garden, replaced by the steel she'd need for the fight ahead. "Then we'd better make certain that by Thursday there's nothing left for him to argue," she said. "A judge doesn't rule against a stable household, Jonathan. He rules against chaos. Right now all Whitmore has is a rumor of chaos. Our task between now and Thursday is to make certain that rumor dies of starvation. And how do we do that? We build something real in 3 days that looks like it's always been here," Mary said. "Routine, structure, a child who is cared for, a household that runs smooth, and a marriage that, whatever its bones, presents itself as steady to anyone who comes looking to prove otherwise." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Something like disbelief mixed with the first genuine relief she'd seen cross his face since she'd met him. "You make it sound simple." "It won't be simple," Mary said. "It'll be exhausting and imperfect, and half of it will probably fall apart before Thursday even arrives. But simple was never on the table the moment you knocked on my door last night. We're not looking for simple, Jonathan. We're looking for enough." The first test of that word enough came at supper that evening when Prudence set 3 places at the long dining table, instead of the 2 that had apparently become custom in the months since Eleanor's death, and Anna, entering the room with the particular stiffness of a child bracing for disappointment, stopped dead at the sight of the extra chair. "She usually eats in the kitchen," Prudence said quietly near Mary's shoulder. "Won't sit at the table since her mother passed. Says it reminds her." Prudence caught herself, glanced at Jonathan, softened her words. "Well, it reminds her." "Then we'll eat in the kitchen," Mary said simply. "Mrs. Hale, the kitchen isn't fitting for—" "I taught school in a room smaller than that kitchen for 6 years, Prudence. I've eaten worse meals in worse places than any kitchen in this house. If the child is more comfortable there, then that is where supper happens tonight." Jonathan, standing near the doorway, opened his mouth as though to object on the grounds of propriety, caught the look Mary gave him, and closed it again. They ate in the kitchen. Anna sat at the small work table, eyes down, hands folded in her lap, for a long while before she finally picked up her spoon, and Mary made a point of not watching her too closely, of talking instead to Jonathan about nothing in particular. The weather, the state of the tobacco crop, the price of salt in town, ordinary conversation meant to fill the air without demanding anything of the small, silent girl between them. Halfway through the meal, Anna's spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the table, and the sound startled all 3 of them, Anna, most of all, her shoulders hunching immediately, as though bracing for a reprimand. "Happens to the best of us," Mary said, without looking up from her own plate, without making a show of the moment at all. "I dropped an entire pitcher of milk on my first day teaching, right in front of 12 children who never let me forget it." Anna's eyes lifted just slightly, just for a moment, toward Mary, and there was something there, not quite curiosity, but the ghost of it, the shape where curiosity used to live before. Grief hollowed it out. Jonathan, watching this small exchange, said nothing, but Mary saw his hands tighten briefly around his own spoon, saw the effort it took him to let the moment breathe, instead of filling it with the desperate attention he'd clearly been giving his daughter for 6 fruitless months. After supper, when Anna had retreated upstairs and Prudence had begun clearing dishes, Jonathan found Mary on the back porch, staring out at the darkening fields. "She looked at you," he said. "Really looked. She hasn't done that with me in weeks." "She looked at me because I gave her nothing to brace against," Mary said. "You've spent 6 months looking at her like she's a puzzle you're desperate to solve." Children can feel that, Jonathan, even silent ones, especially silent ones. They feel the weight of being watched for progress, and it makes them retreat further, not less. "Then what am I supposed to do? Ignore her?" "No," Mary said. "You're supposed to exist near her without asking anything of her. Let her come to the noticing on her own time, not yours." "That could take months." "It could take years," Mary said. "Grief doesn't keep a calendar, Jonathan. It keeps its own clock, and the cruelest thing anyone can do to a grieving child is demand she heal on a schedule that suits the adults around her." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its usual composure. "Eleanor would have known what to do. She always knew what Anna needed before Anna knew it herself." "I'm not Eleanor," Mary said. "I won't pretend to have her instincts or her history with that child. But I know something about grief, and I know something about children who go quiet because the world has already asked too much of them. That's what I brought into this marriage, Jonathan. Not love, not replacement, just that." "It's more than I had yesterday," Jonathan said quietly. Mary didn't answer that. She simply watched the fields fade into darkness, and somewhere behind them, in a house still learning the shape of its new arrangement, a rooster called once into the coming night, confused about the hour, and fell silent again. The days between the wedding and Whitmore's promised return moved with a strange compressed urgency, each one carrying the weight of preparation for a fight none of them could fully predict the shape of. Mary rose before the household each morning, a habit worn into her from years of preparing lessons before her students arrived, and she used those early hours to walk the grounds to learn the rhythms of a house that wasn't hers yet, but would need to look by Thursday like it had always been. On the second morning, she found Anna already awake in the garden, sitting in the same spot as before, and this time, instead of speaking first, Mary simply sat down a small distance away and began sketching in the dirt with a stick. Nothing elaborate, just simple shapes, the kind she used to draw for her youngest students who hadn't yet learned their letters. Anna watched. Mary could feel the watching without turning her head, the particular quality of attention a wary animal gives something it hasn't decided is safe yet. "This is an A," Mary said, drawing the letter slow and deliberate in the soft earth. "For Anna. Did you know your name starts with the same letter as apple and arrow and afternoon?" No response, but the watching continued sharper now, more focused. "I used to teach children your age their letters." Mary continued, drawing a rough apple shape beside the A. "Some of them hated it. Thought letters were the most boring thing in the whole world. But I always thought there was something a little bit magic in it, that scratches in the dirt or ink on paper could hold a whole thought inside them, waiting for someone to come along and let it out." Anna's finger twitched in her lap, the smallest motion, but Mary caught it, and something in her chest tightened with something close to hope. "You don't have to draw anything," Mary said, keeping her voice light, unhurried, unattached to any particular outcome. "I just like company while I do it, even quiet company." She kept drawing simple shapes, small doodles, nothing that demanded response, and after nearly 10 minutes of silence, Anna's hand moved, slowly, hesitantly. She reached down, picked up a small stick of her own, and in the dirt beside Mary's letters drew a single wobbling line. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a word. It was barely a mark at all. But it was the first thing Anna Hale had voluntarily created with her own hands in 6 months, and Mary had to look away toward the roses for a moment, blinking hard before she trusted her voice enough to speak again. "That's a fine line," she said when she'd composed herself. "Straight as any I've ever seen." Anna didn't look up, but she didn't erase the line either, and when Mary rose a few minutes later to return to the house, she left it undisturbed in the dirt, a small wobbling mark that meant more than any words could have carried. She told Jonathan about it that evening and watched something break open in his face. Not quite tears, but close enough that he turned toward the window before he trusted himself to respond. "A line," he said. "She drew a line." "A line," Mary confirmed. "It's not nothing, Jonathan." "No," he said, his voice rough. "No, it's not nothing at all. But I need you to understand something," Mary said, and her tone shifted firmer, now the tone she used when a lesson needed to land without softening. "Whatever progress happens with Anna, it will happen slowly on her time, and it will not happen because you push for it or because you need it to happen in time for Thursday's hearing. If you turn her healing into a performance for the judge, you will undo every inch of trust I'm trying to build with her, and you will confirm every fear that child has that the adults around her care more about appearances than about her. I would never. You bought her a pony she's never ridden." Mary said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth of it either. "You've been trying to buy your way into her trust for 6 months because it's faster than the slow work of earning it. I understand why. Grief makes people desperate for shortcuts. But there are no shortcuts here, Jonathan. There's only showing up day after day without demanding anything in return, until eventually she believes you're not going anywhere." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his hands braced against the windowsill, his shoulders carrying a weight Mary suspected had been sitting there since the day his wife died, and he'd realized he had no idea how to be the parent his daughter needed. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted finally. "I don't know how to just exist near someone without trying to fix what's broken." "Then you'll learn," Mary said. "The same way I'm learning. None of us came into this arrangement with the answers already in hand. We're building this as we go, Jonathan. That's the only honest thing I can tell you." The third day brought its own complications, arriving in the form of a visit from 2 women Mary recognized instantly as the particular breed of neighbor who mistook gossip for concern, and concern for a kind of social currency worth spending freely. Mrs. Abigail Cross and her sister, Mrs. Louisa Farr, arrived unannounced just past mid-morning, ostensibly to offer condolences on Mary's recent widowhood and congratulations on her recent marriage. 2 sentiments so violently opposed that Mary nearly laughed at the absurdity of receiving both in the same visit, from the same mouths, within the same 10 minutes. "We simply had to see for ourselves," Mrs. Cross said, settling into the parlor, with the confidence of a woman who had never once considered her presence might be unwelcome. "The whole county is talking, you understand. A widow marrying within a day of burying her husband. Well, I don't need to tell you how such things look." "I imagine you don't," Mary said. "Though I notice you've told me anyway." Mrs. Farr tittered nervously, glancing between her sister and Mary, as though watching a duel she hadn't expected to witness so early in the day. "We only worry for you," Mrs. Cross continued, undeterred. "A man like Jonathan Hale marrying so quickly after his own wife's passing. One does wonder what a woman gains from such an arrangement beyond the obvious material comforts, of course. I gained a child who needed protecting from a man trying to steal her out of her own home," Mary said plainly. "I gained the chance to prevent a 6-year-old from being handed off to relatives more interested in her father's land than her well-being. If you'd like to call that a material comfort, Mrs. Cross, you're welcome to, but I'd ask you to say it to the child's face first and see how the words taste." The parlor went very quiet. Mrs. Farr's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. "I only meant, I know precisely what you meant," Mary said, not unkindly, but without any give in her voice either. You meant to come here, take the measure of the scandal, and carry it back into town dressed up as sympathy. I understand the custom. I simply won't participate in it. If you have genuine concern for this family, you're welcome to express it plainly, and I'll answer plainly in return. If you've come only to collect material for your next social call, I'd ask you to collect it elsewhere." Mrs. Cross's face flushed a deep mottled red, and for a moment Mary thought the woman might storm out entirely. But instead, she gathered herself with the particular stiffness of someone unaccustomed to being spoken to so directly. "The whole county will hear about this visit," she said. "I imagine they will," Mary said. "The whole county seems remarkably efficient at hearing about things. I'd only ask that when you tell them accurately. Tell them Jonathan Hale's new wife has no patience for gossip dressed as charity, and less patience still for anyone who mistakes a frightened child's silence for entertainment." The two women left shortly after, considerably less warmly than they'd arrived, and Prudence, who had been hovering near the parlor doorway throughout the entire exchange, allowed herself the smallest, most reluctant smile as she came to clear the untouched tea service. "That's the first time in 6 months anybody's shut Abigail Cross's mouth that fast," she said. "It won't be the last time she talks about me," Mary said. "But I'd rather she talk about a woman who defended this family than a woman who let herself be picked apart for the sake of politeness. The whole town's going to call you difficult." "Let them," Mary said. "I've been called worse things for better reasons." That night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room that had somehow become hers, Mary walked the upstairs hallway and found herself outside Anna's door, drawn by a sound she couldn't immediately place, soft, muffled, rhythmic. Crying. The particular quality of a child trying desperately to cry without being heard. Mary stood outside the door for a long moment, torn between the instinct to enter and the promise she'd made herself not to force anything the child hadn't invited. Finally, she knocked soft once. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the tight-held silence of someone caught. "It's only me," Mary said quietly through the door. "I heard something and wanted to make sure you were all right. You don't have to answer. You don't have to let me in. I just wanted you to know I was here in case being alone felt too heavy tonight." Silence. Long enough that Mary nearly turned to leave. Then the soft sound of small feet against floorboards, and the door opened just a crack. Not fully. Not an invitation exactly. But not a refusal either. Mary did not push it further open. She simply sat down on the floor outside the door, her back against the frame, and waited. "I used to be afraid of storms," she said, into the narrow gap of open door, into the dark hallway, into whatever space Anna was willing to share. "When I was your age. My mother would sit outside my door, just like this, not even come in, just sit there so I'd know she was close if I needed her. She never made me talk about being scared. She just stayed." The door didn't open further, but it didn't close either. "I'll stay as long as you want me to," Mary said. "You don't have to say anything at all." They sat like that for nearly an hour, Mary on one side of the door, Anna presumably on the other, until the small sounds of crying eventually gave way to the deeper, slower breathing of a child, finally mercifully asleep. Mary rose quietly, careful not to disturb the moment, and found Jonathan standing at the end of the hallway, having apparently witnessed the last portion of the exchange without announcing himself. "How long were you standing there?" Mary asked. "Long enough?" He said, his voice thick with something he was clearly fighting to control. "She's never let anyone sit with her like that, not even me." "She didn't let me in," Mary said. "She only tolerated me outside the door. There's a difference, and it matters." "It matters that she tolerated anything," Jonathan said. "Do you understand what you just did?" "I sat on a floor," Mary said simply. "That's all it was." "That's not all it was," Jonathan said, and something in his voice had shifted, some wall coming down that Mary hadn't fully anticipated. "That's the first time in 6 months that child has let another living soul near her grief without shutting the door entirely. You did that in 3 days. Mary didn't have a response for that, not immediately, because the weight of what she'd stumbled into, the responsibility of it, the fragile trust building beneath her feet before she'd even fully agreed to want it pressed down harder than she'd expected. "Don't make it more than it is," she said finally. "One night doesn't undo 6 months. Tomorrow she may retreat further than ever and we'll have to start again from nothing. That's how this works, Jonathan. Slow and uneven and never a straight line toward better." "I understand that. Do you—" Mary studied him in the dim hallway light. "Because Thursday is coming, and I need to know that whatever happens with Whitmore, whatever the judge decides, you understand that Anna's healing isn't a case you win in a courtroom. It's a war fought one quiet night at a time, for years maybe. Are you prepared for that kind of patience?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty Mary hadn't heard in him since the night he'd first knocked on her door. "I buried my wife not knowing how to keep my own daughter from disappearing into her own silence," he said. "I have nothing left to lose by being patient, Mary. I only have everything left to lose by giving up." Thursday arrived faster than any of them were ready for. The county courthouse sat small and unremarkable at the center of town, the kind of building that held enormous consequences inside walls, too plain to suggest the weight of what happened there and when. Mary walked up its steps beside Jonathan, dressed in the one good dress she owned that wasn't morning black. She felt the eyes of the gathered townspeople like physical weight against her shoulders. Whitmore was already inside, seated beside a lawyer. Mary didn't recognize his wife. Beside him, wearing an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. Judge Harlan Pruitt entered a few minutes later, an older man with the tired, patient bearing of someone who had presided over more family disputes than he cared to remember, and he wasted no time on pleasantries before calling the room to order. "This court is here to determine the custody arrangement for the minor child Anna Hale in light of concerns raised by her uncle regarding the stability of her current household," the judge said. "Mr. Whitmore, you may present your concerns." Whitmore's lawyer rose smooth and rehearsed, and Mary felt her stomach tighten as he began outlining the case against Jonathan: the mother's death, the child's continued silence, the sudden, and as he characterized it, suspiciously convenient, remarriage that had occurred less than 24 hours after Mary's own husband's burial. "We do not dispute Mr. Hale's love for his daughter," the lawyer said. "We dispute his capacity to provide the stable, nurturing environment a traumatized child requires. A marriage assembled overnight to a woman he met mere hours before the ceremony is not stability, Your Honor. It is desperation dressed in a wedding gown." Mary felt Jonathan tense beside her, his hands curling into fists against his thighs, and she placed her own hand briefly over his. Not for comfort exactly, but as a reminder. Steady, we agreed to be steady, and felt some of the tension ease slightly beneath her touch. When it was their turn to speak, Mary rose before Jonathan could, and the judge's eyebrows lifted slightly at the widow standing to address the court on her new husband's behalf. "Your Honor, I understand how this looks," Mary said. "I buried my first husband on Tuesday afternoon and married Mr. Hale before sunrise the following morning. I understand the speed invites suspicion. I would invite that same suspicion myself if I were sitting where you are." The judge said nothing, watching her carefully. "But I'd ask the court to consider what desperation actually looks like when it's not dressed up in legal language," Mary continued. "Desperation looks like a father who has spent 6 months trying everything he knows to reach a silent, grieving child and finding all of it insufficient. It looks like a man humble enough to admit he needed help and desperate enough to seek it from a stranger, rather than watch his daughter be taken by relatives who have visited her, by my count, less than a handful of times since her mother's death." Whitmore's face darkened, but Mary continued before he could interject. "I did not marry Jonathan Hale for love, Your Honor. I won't stand here and lie to this court about that. I married him because I recognized in his desperation something I understood: the desperation of watching a child suffer and being unable to fix it fast enough. I have spent the last 3 days with Anna Hale. I have sat with her in silence. I have watched her draw a single line in the dirt, the first thing she has voluntarily created with her own hands in 6 months. I have heard her cry through a closed door and sat outside it until she fell asleep, because that was the only comfort she would accept." The courtroom had gone very quiet. "I cannot promise this court that Anna will heal quickly," Mary said. I cannot promise she'll speak again by any particular date, or that this arrangement will look from the outside like the picture of a normal family for some time yet. What I can promise is presence, consistency, a household where she is not pushed to perform recovery for the benefit of adults who need reassurance faster than grief allows. I would ask the court to consider which environment serves that child better, one built on patience and slow trust, or one that uproots her from the only parent she has left, and places her instead with relatives whose primary demonstrated interest thus far has been in her father's land holdings rather than her well-being. The accusation landed hard, and Whitmore shot up from his seat. That is a baseless slander. Is it? Mary turned to face him directly. Then perhaps you'd care to explain to this court why your visits to your niece increased only after your late sister's estate documents were finalized, granting her a trust that would transfer to your management should her father be found unfit. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Pruitt's gavel came down sharply. Order, he said. Mrs. Hale, that is a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support it? Mary held his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs at the gamble she'd just taken a piece of information Jonathan had mentioned only in passing. 2 nights before, a detail about Eleanor's trust that Mary had turned over in her mind ever since, waiting for the right moment to use it. I would ask the court to review the estate documents themselves, Mary said. I believe they will speak more clearly than I can. Judge Pruitt's eyes moved to Whitmore, who had gone pale beneath his earlier bluster, and something in the room shifted the balance of the entire hearing, tilting on the axis of a single uncomfortable question now hanging unanswered in the air. We will recess, the judge said finally, while the court reviews the relevant estate documentation. This hearing will resume in 1 hour. The gavel came down again, and the courtroom began to empty. But Mary remained seated for a long moment, feeling the weight of what she'd just done. The accusation, she couldn't fully prove the risk she'd taken on nothing more than instinct, and the shape of a man's guilt she'd glimpsed once in a dooryard 3 days before. Jonathan leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. Is it true about the trust? I don't know, Mary admitted. But I watched his face when I said it, Jonathan. A man with nothing to hide doesn't go that pale over a guess. The hour crawled by the way waiting always did, when the outcome sat entirely in someone else's hands. Mary paced the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, Jonathan beside her. Silent, his jaw working the way it had the night he'd first pounded on her door. You shouldn't have said it, he murmured finally. If you're wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll stand here and apologize to Whitmore in front of the whole county, Mary said. But I don't think I'm wrong, Jonathan. A man doesn't lose his color like that over an idle accusation. Guilt has a look to it. I've seen it on children caught cheating their sums. I saw the same look on his face just now, only bigger because grown men have more to lose than a slate wiped clean. And if the documents show nothing, then we've lost nothing we hadn't already risked, Mary said. But I'd wager my mother's Bible that trust has strings on it Whitmore doesn't want pulled. The courtroom doors opened sooner than expected, a clerk stepping out to summon them back inside, and Mary felt her pulse climb as she took her seat beside Jonathan, watching Judge Pruitt settle behind the bench with a stack of papers and an expression considerably graver than the one he'd worn before the recess. I have reviewed the estate documentation submitted by both counsel, the judge said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had found something he hadn't expected to find. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps you'd care to explain to this court why 3 months prior to your sister's death, you petitioned her directly for access to funds held in trust for her daughter, citing what you described as a temporary business difficulty. The courtroom went utterly silent. Whitmore's lawyer turned sharply toward his client, and Mary watched the color drain further from Whitmore's face, watched his hands grip the edge of the table in front of him. That was a private family matter, Whitmore said, his voice tight. It became a public matter the moment you filed a custody claim implying Mr. Hale's household was unfit, Judge Pruitt said. I find it more than a passing coincidence that a man denied access to his niece's trust while her mother lived should suddenly discover deep concern for that same niece's welfare within weeks of her mother's death, particularly when guardianship would grant him direct management of those very funds until she reaches majority. Your Honor, I resent the implication. You may resent it, the judge said. But resentment does not answer the question. Did you or did you not request access to that trust from your sister before her death? The silence stretched long enough that Mary could hear her own heartbeat, and when Whitmore finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier bluster. I had debts, he said quietly. Eleanor refused me. She said the money was Anna's, not mine to borrow against. And after her death, the debts didn't disappear with her, Whitmore said, and something bitter crept into his tone. Now some resentment long buried finally cracking through. A man does what he must. A man does not use a grieving child as collateral for his own financial failures, Judge Pruitt said, and his voice had gone hard now, unforgiving. This court finds no evidence to support the claim that Jonathan Hale's household is unfit to raise his daughter. This court further finds significant cause for concern regarding the motivations behind this custody petition and will be referring the matter of the trust documentation to the appropriate authorities for further review. Whitmore's lawyer was on his feet immediately, already speaking of appeals of further hearings, but Judge Pruitt raised a hand and silenced him with a single look. Custody of Anna Hale remains with her father, the judge said. This court sees no cause to disturb that arrangement and finds Mrs. Hale's testimony regarding the child's ongoing care to be both credible and frankly more thoughtful than most testimony I hear in this courtroom. This hearing is concluded. The gavel came down, and the sound of it seemed to release something in Mary's chest she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment she'd first spoken Whitmore's secret aloud on nothing but instinct. Jonathan turned to her, his face a mixture of disbelief and something raw, something closer to the desperate hope he'd carried into her cabin 4 days before. You were right, he said. I was fortunate, Mary said. There's a difference, and I'd rather not test my fortune twice in one lifetime. Whitmore did not look at either of them as he gathered his things and left the courtroom, his wife trailing behind him with an expression that had finally shed its performed sympathy for something closer to genuine embarrassment. And Mary watched them go, with no satisfaction at all. Only a tired, hollow relief that the fight, at least this particular fight, had ended the way it needed to. The ride home passed mostly in silence, both of them worn thin by the morning's events, and it was only as the house came into view that Jonathan finally spoke. He won't stop, he said. Men like Whitmore don't stop just because a judge tells them to. No, Mary agreed. But he'll be slower about it now. A man under investigation for his own debts has less appetite for a second fight he might lose worse than the first. And if he tries again, then we'll be ready again, Mary said. But today, Jonathan, let's allow ourselves the small mercy of a fight that's actually finished. There will be time enough for the next one when it comes. They found Anna waiting on the porch when they arrived, Prudence standing behind her with a hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. And the moment the carriage came to a stop, Anna's eyes fixed on her father's face with an intensity that suggested she'd understood somehow exactly what today had meant. Jonathan knelt in front of her before he'd even fully dismounted, his voice thick. You're staying with me, Anna. Nobody's taking you anywhere. Do you understand? Anna didn't speak, but she stepped forward closer than she'd stood to her father voluntarily, in longer than Mary had witnessed, and pressed her small hand flat against his chest over his heart, the way a person might check that something was still beating. Jonathan made a sound Mary had never heard a grown man make before, something between a laugh and a sob. And he did not move, did not reach for her, did not do anything except let his daughter's hand rest there, as long as she wanted it to. Mary stood back, giving them the moment, feeling something in her own chest tighten at the sight of it. Grief and hope tangled together in a way she hadn't expected to feel this soon after burying Thomas. This soon after everything. That night, once Anna had finally been coaxed to bed, and the house had settled into the particular quiet that came after a day too large for its own hours, Mary found herself back on the porch, the same spot where she'd first begun to understand the shape of the family she'd married into. Jonathan joined her a few minutes later, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and passed one to her without a word. "I keep thinking about what you said," he said finally. "About it being a war fought one quiet night at a time. It is. I don't know if I've got the patience for years of it." "You don't have a choice," Mary said, not unkindly. "Patience isn't something you either have or don't have, Jonathan. It's something you practice badly over and over until eventually it stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like habit." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "Whitmore said something to me before we left the courthouse. Said I'd married a woman with more spine than sense." "He's not entirely wrong," Mary said, "though I'd argue the two aren't as opposed as he thinks." "I meant to thank you," Jonathan said, "for what you did in there. I don't know how you knew about the trust." "I didn't know," Mary said. "I guessed. I've spent years watching people lie about smaller things than money, Jonathan. The tells don't change much between a child hiding a broken slate and a man hiding a debt. Both of them go quiet in the same particular way right before the truth catches up to them." "You could have been wrong, badly wrong, in front of the whole county." "I could have," Mary agreed. "But I've found that the alternative, staying silent out of fear of being wrong, usually costs more than the risk of speaking and missing the mark. I'd rather be wrong loudly than right too quietly to matter." Jonathan studied her for a long moment in the dim porch light, something shifting behind his eyes that Mary couldn't quite name, something that unsettled her slightly with its warmth. "Eleanor was quiet," he said. "Careful. She thought everything through 3 times before she said a word of it out loud." "I'm not Eleanor," Mary said again, the same words she'd offered him days before, though this time they carried a different weight, less like a warning, and more like a simple fact laid plainly on the table between them. "I know that," Jonathan said. "I'm not asking you to be." Something in his voice made Mary look away first, toward the dark fields, toward the place where Thomas's grave sat many miles distant, now still fresh, still hers to grieve properly, whenever the current crisis finally allowed her the luxury of doing so. "It's late," she said. "Tomorrow will ask just as much of us as today did, I imagine. Probably more." Jonathan agreed, and if he noticed her retreat from whatever moment had briefly opened between them. He didn't push against it, only rose and offered her his hand to help her up from the porch step. A small courtesy that felt somehow larger than it should have. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite planned, but both recognized gradually as something approaching stability. Mary rose early, walked the grounds, sat with Anna in the garden, whether the child acknowledged her or not, and slowly, so slowly, it was easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. The silences between them began to shift in quality, less like walls, and more like the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had simply run out of urgent need to fill the air. Anna began leaving small marks in the dirt each morning, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something, and Mary found herself building small lessons around them without ever calling attention to the fact that she was teaching at all, naming the shapes Anna drew, connecting them gently to words, to sounds, planting seeds she had no intention of forcing to bloom before their season. It was on a Tuesday nearly 3 weeks after the hearing that Anna made a sound. Not a word. Not yet. But a sound. A small, surprised laugh quickly swallowed when one of the barn cats knocked over a bucket and sent a chicken into an undignified squawking retreat across the yard. Mary, standing nearby, did not react visibly, did not turn with delighted surprise, or call attention to what had just happened, because she understood with absolute certainty that any acknowledgement large enough to frighten the moment would send Anna retreating twice as far as she'd just advanced. Instead, Mary simply laughed along with her, easy and unremarkable, as though children laughing at chaotic chickens was the most ordinary thing in the world. But that night, once Anna was asleep, Mary told Jonathan and watched him press both hands over his face and hold them there for a long moment before he trusted himself to speak. "A laugh," he said, muffled behind his palms. She laughed. She did. 6 months, he said. 6 months of nothing, And she laughed at a chicken. Grief doesn't care what finally cracks it open, Mary said. Sometimes it's a chicken. Sometimes it's a line drawn in the dirt. The specific thing matters less than the fact that something got through. Jonathan lowered his hands, and his eyes were wet unashamedly, so in a way Mary suspected he wouldn't have allowed himself in front of anyone else. "I don't know how to repay this," he said. "You're not meant to repay it," Mary said. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" The question hung between them longer than Mary was entirely comfortable with, because she didn't have an answer that felt fully honest. Not yet. Not when so much of what she'd told herself about this marriage presence, not love. Partnership, not romance, had begun to feel less like armor and more like a wall. She wasn't certain she wanted standing anymore. "It's the work I agreed to," she said finally, choosing the safer answer, the one that didn't require her to examine feelings she hadn't given herself permission to have yet. Nothing more complicated than that. Jonathan didn't push her on it, though something in his expression suggested he didn't fully believe her, and Mary retreated to her own room that night, grateful for once that the house was large enough to give her the distance she needed from a truth she wasn't ready to name. The peace didn't last, because peace rarely did in a story like theirs, and it broke on a morning in early autumn, when Prudence came running from the kitchen garden with a look on her face that stopped Mary's heart before a single word left the woman's mouth. "It's Anna," Prudence gasped. "She's took sick. Fever came on sudden not an hour past. She's burning up something fierce." Mary was moving before Prudence finished speaking, taking the stairs 2 at a time, and found Anna in her bed, already flushed and glassy-eyed, her small body trembling despite the sweat beading along her hairline. "Send for the doctor," Mary said, already reaching for the basin of water on the washstand, already working with the efficient calm she'd learned years ago tending sick children in her schoolroom, the ones whose parents couldn't always be reached in time. "Now, Prudence, don't wait for Jonathan to come back from the fields. Send someone else to fetch him and send the fastest horse for the doctor." Prudence fled, and Mary set to work wringing cool cloths and laying them against Anna's forehead and wrists, murmuring low reassurances that required no response, because whatever else was happening, the child needed steadiness, more than she needed words right now. Anna's fever climbed through the morning, despite Mary's efforts, and by the time Jonathan burst into the room, wild-eyed and covered in the dust of a hard ride, back from the fields, Anna had begun murmuring in her sleep, fragments of words too jumbled to fully understand. "How bad?" Jonathan demanded. "Bad enough," Mary said, not softening it. "The doctor's been sent for. Until he arrives, we keep her cool and we keep her comfortable, and we do not panic in front of her because children in fever dreams remember fear even when they don't remember anything else." Jonathan knelt beside the bed, taking his daughter's small hand in his, and Mary watched him fight visibly against every instinct that told him to do something more to fix this, the way he'd tried to fix everything else with money, with urgency, with force of will alone. "You're doing fine," Mary told him quietly. "Just stay. That's all she needs from you right now." Anna's murmuring grew clearer as the fever climbed, fragments resolving slowly into words, and then without warning, into a sentence that stopped both of their hearts entirely. "Mama," Anna murmured, eyes still closed, lost somewhere in the fever's grip. "Mama, don't leave me. Don't leave me, Mama." Jonathan made a sound like something breaking, and his grip on his daughter's hand tightened until Mary gently touched his wrist, a silent reminder to loosen it before he hurt her. "She's dreaming of the day her mother died," Mary said softly. "This happens sometimes with fever. Old griefs come back up to the surface when the body's too weak to keep them buried." "What do I do?" Jonathan's voice cracked entirely now, all his careful composure gone. "Mary, what do I do?" "You stay calm," Mary said firm, despite the ache in her own chest at the sight of him unraveling. "You let her hear your voice low and steady, even if she doesn't wake. Children in fever dreams find their way back toward whatever voice sounds safest." Jonathan swallowed hard, and when he spoke his voice shook but held. "I'm here, Anna. Papa's here. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." Anna's small body twitched her brow, furrowing deeper, and for a terrible moment Mary feared the fever had climbed past the point where voices could reach her at all. Then faintly, Anna's fingers curled around her father's hand. The doctor arrived within the hour, an older man named Dr. Ashford, whom Mary recognized by reputation if not by face, and his examination was thorough, careful, his expression grave enough that Mary felt her own composure fraying at the edges, despite her best efforts to hold it together for Jonathan's sake. "The fever's high," Dr. Ashford said finally. "Not dangerously so, not yet, but it needs watching close through the night. Children her age can turn quickly for better or worse, and I won't pretend otherwise." "What caused it?" Jonathan asked. "Could be any number of things. A summer chill caught late, something in the water, simple bad luck. I don't see signs of anything worse, but I'll not lie to you and say I'm certain of anything with fevers this sudden." "What do we do?" Mary asked. "Keep her cool. Keep her fed when she'll take it, even small sips of broth. And keep her calm, which sounds simple enough, until you're the one sitting with a frightened, feverish child through the dark hours of the night." Dr. Ashford looked between the two of them, something softening in his weathered face. "You've got each other at least. That counts for more than most folks realize in nights like the one ahead of you." He left instructions and a small vial of medicine to help with the fever, promising to return in the morning. And once his carriage had pulled away, Mary and Jonathan settled in for what both of them understood without needing to say it aloud would be a long and frightening night. The hours crawled. Anna's fever rose and fell in waves, each spike bringing fresh, murmured fragments of grief and fear, each ebb bringing a fragile, temporary relief that neither of them dared trust fully. Around midnight, during one of the worst spikes, Anna's small body began to shake, and Jonathan's panic returned in full force, his hands hovering uselessly over his daughter, as though afraid to touch her, and afraid not to. "Mary, I'm here. Hold her hand. Keep talking to her. Don't stop." Mary worked quickly, replacing the cooling cloths, checking the water Prudence had left warming on the small stove in the corner for broth. "This is normal, Jonathan. Frightening but normal. Fevers do this. It doesn't mean the worst." "You don't know that." "No," Mary admitted. "I don't know it for certain, but panicking won't make it less true either way, and Anna needs us steady more than she needs us honest about our fear right now." Jonathan forced his voice back into something resembling calm murmuring to his daughter in a low, unbroken stream. Memories of her mother, stories of when she was a baby, anything and everything he could think to say, and slowly, gradually, the shaking eased. By the deepest hours of the night, both of them exhausted past the point of proper thought, Mary found herself seated beside Jonathan on the edge of Anna's bed, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched both of them, watching the rise and fall of a small chest, willing it to keep rising, keep falling, keep going. "Thank you," Jonathan said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on his daughter. "For staying. For all of it." "I told you I would. You told me you'd stay for the marriage," Jonathan said. "For the arrangement. This is different. This is—" He stopped searching for the word. "This is a mother's kind of staying." Mary's throat tightened, and she didn't trust herself to answer that directly. Not tonight, not with Anna's fever still climbing and falling in unpredictable waves, not with her own careful boundaries, feeling thinner and more fragile than they had in weeks. "Get some rest," she said instead gently. "I'll watch her the next few hours. You can't help her if you collapse from exhaustion first." "I won't sleep." "Then rest anyway. Close your eyes, even if sleep doesn't come. She needs you steady tomorrow, not hollowed out from a sleepless night." Jonathan finally relented, stretching out in the chair beside the bed rather than leaving the room entirely, and within minutes, his breathing had evened into the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who had been running on fear alone for far too many hours. Mary sat alone with Anna, then the house silent around them, and she took the child's small hand in hers, careful not to wake her, careful only to be present the way she'd promised, the way she'd been promising in 100 small ways since the night she'd first walked into this house, a widow of a single day. "You hang on now," Mary murmured, so quiet even the walls could barely hear it. "You hang on, little one. There's a whole life waiting on the other side of this fever, and I intend to see you live every day of it." Anna's fingers, so small against Mary's palm, tightened slightly, whether from fever or from some deeper instinct Mary couldn't say. and she took it as the only answer she needed. The fever broke just before dawn. Mary noticed it first in the change of Anna's breathing, the way it deepened and slowed from its earlier ragged shallowness into something closer to ordinary sleep, and when she pressed the back of her hand to the child's forehead, the heat that had frightened them both through the night had finally mercifully begun to recede. She woke Jonathan gently and watched relief break across his face like sunrise itself as he confirmed what Mary had already found. "She's cooler," he breathed. "Mary, she's cooler." "The fever's breaking," Mary confirmed. "She'll likely sleep hard through the morning, but I think the worst of it has passed." Jonathan sat back in his chair, both hands scrubbing over his exhausted face, and when he looked up at Mary again, something in his expression had shifted entirely. Some final wall coming down that Mary suspected had been cracking since the night he'd first knocked on her door. "I don't know how to thank you for tonight," he said. "For any of it. Not just tonight. All of it since the beginning." "You don't need to thank me," Mary said. "I made a promise, Jonathan. This is what keeping it looks like." "It's more than a promise now," he said quietly. "Isn't it?" Mary didn't answer right away, because the truth of it had been building in her chest for weeks now, quiet and unwelcome, a feeling she'd told herself repeatedly. She had no right to, not this soon, not with Thomas, barely 3 weeks in the ground, not with a marriage built on paper and necessity, rather than anything resembling love. "I don't know what it is yet," she said finally honestly. "I only know I couldn't have watched that child suffer tonight and felt nothing beyond obligation. Whatever that means, Jonathan, I haven't fully worked it out myself." "Take your time working it out," Jonathan said. "I'm not asking for more than you're ready to give. I just wanted you to know that I see it too, whatever it is." Anna stirred slightly between them, murmuring something too soft to catch, and both of them turned their attention back to her immediately. The moment between them set aside unfinished, but not forgotten, waiting for whatever future morning might finally give it room to breathe. By midday, Anna woke fully weak but clear-eyed, and when Prudence brought a small bowl of broth up to the room, the girl managed several spoonfuls before exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep. "She's going to be all right," Dr. Ashford confirmed on his return visit that afternoon. "Fevers like that frighten everyone half to death, but children bounce back quicker than we give them credit for. Keep her resting, keep her fed, and I expect she'll be back to her usual self within the week." Her usual self. Jonathan repeated, something wry and exhausted in his voice. "I'm not sure what that even means anymore, given everything that's changed these past weeks." "Means she's alive to keep changing," Dr. Ashford said, simply gathering his bag. "That's usual enough for me." After the doctor left, Mary found herself standing in the doorway of Anna's room, watching the child sleep peacefully for the first time in nearly a day, and Jonathan came to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, neither of them moving away from the contact. "She said mama last night," Jonathan said quietly. "In the fever. She hasn't said any word not since Eleanor died, and the first one that came out of her was that." "Grief finds its own way out," Mary said. "Sometimes through fever, sometimes through drawings in the dirt. It doesn't ask permission for when or how it surfaces." "Do you think she'll speak again properly, awake?" "I think she's closer than she's been in 6 months," Mary said. "I think last night cracked something open that had been sealed shut a long time. Whether it opens further, and when, that's not something either of us gets to decide. But I believe it's coming, Jonathan. I believe it more today than I did yesterday." Jonathan turned to look at her fully. Then, and something passed between them in the quiet doorway. Exhaustion and relief, and the strange, unexpected tenderness of two people who had spent a terrifying night fighting for the same small life, side by side, without pretense, without the careful boundaries either of them had tried to maintain since the night of their hurried wedding. "Mary," he said low. "Don't," she said, though there was no real firmness behind it, only a kind of tired honesty. "Not today. I can't sort through what any of this means today, Jonathan. I'm too tired and too frightened still from last night, and too unsure of my own heart to trust anything it's telling me right now." "Then I'll wait," Jonathan said simply. I've gotten good at waiting this past month. I can wait a while longer for you too. Mary didn't answer that, not directly, but she didn't step away from him either, and the two of them stood together in the doorway, a long while, watching Anna sleep, listening to the steady ordinary rhythm of a small chest rising and falling. No longer laboring, no longer fighting, simply breathing, simply alive, simply theirs to protect, for however many more nights it might take before the whole fragile family finally truly believed itself safe. Anna recovered through the following week the way Mary had promised she would, slowly and unevenly, some days brighter than others, but each morning finding her a little steadier than the last. And by the time a full week had passed since the fever broke, she was back in her garden spot beneath the roses, stronger, if not yet entirely herself. It was on one of those recovering afternoons that Prudence came to Mary with a folded letter, her expression carrying a wariness Mary had learned to read as trouble arriving in slower form than Whitmore's carriage wheels. "Came by post rider not an hour ago," Prudence said. "Addressed to Mr. Hale, but I thought you ought to see the seal on it first." Mary took the letter and recognized the crest immediately. The county court, the same seal that had marked the custody papers weeks before. Her stomach tightened. "Where's Jonathan?" "Out at the east field seeing to the harvest." "Send for him," Mary said. "Now, Prudence, whatever this is, he needs to see it before I do." Jonathan arrived within the half hour, dust still clinging to his boots, and when Mary handed him the letter, she watched his face change as he read it, the color draining slowly from his cheeks. "They're reopening the inquiry into the trust," he said. "Whitmore's lawyer filed a countersuit. Says the accusation Mary made in court was slander unsubstantiated and that it damaged his client's reputation beyond what the evidence supported. But the judge found the debts," Mary said. "He found Whitmore's own admission. He admitted asking for money. He didn't admit to any scheme against Anna. His lawyer's arguing there's a difference, and apparently enough of a difference that the court wants a second hearing." Jonathan's hand trembled slightly as he set the letter down. They want it in 2 weeks. Mary felt the floor of her careful confidence shift beneath her. She had spoken that accusation on nothing but instinct and the shape of a guilty man's face, and now that instinct would be tested formally publicly with considerably higher stakes than the first hearing had carried. "If he wins this," Jonathan said slowly, "if the court finds you slandered him, then it opens the custody question again," Mary finished. "Because a woman who lied under oath isn't the stabilizing influence a judge wants in a child's household. Mary, I know what I saw in his face, Jonathan. I still believe it. But belief and proof aren't the same thing, and I built my entire testimony on the space between them." She sat down heavily, the weight of what she'd risked finally settling on her the way it hadn't in the adrenaline of the courtroom weeks before. "We need more than instinct this time. We need something solid." "Where would we even look?" Mary was quiet for a long moment, turning the problem over the way she used to turn over a difficult lesson, searching for the angle that would make it click into place. "Eleanor's belongings," she said finally. "Has anyone gone through her personal papers since she died?" "No," Jonathan admitted. "I couldn't. Prudence packed most of it away, but I never had the heart to look through it myself." "Then we look now," Mary said. "If Eleanor refused Whitmore money before she died, there may be a record of it. A letter. Something in her own hand that shows this wasn't invented, that the debt and the refusal were real, long before her death, gave him motive to come after the trust a different way." They found the trunk in the attic that same evening, and Jonathan's hands shook as he lifted the lid, revealing neatly folded dresses, a few pieces of jewelry, and beneath them a modest stack of correspondence tied with a faded ribbon. "I can't," Jonathan said, staring at the letters. "I don't think I can read her handwriting right now, Mary. Not for this. Not going through her private words looking for ammunition against her own brother." Mary understood the weight of what she was asking, understood that grief did not care how urgent the present crisis was, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Then let me," she said. "You don't have to look at a single page. Just sit with me while I do it if you want company, or go check on Anna if you need distance. Either way, I'll only share what matters." Jonathan chose to stay sitting silently in the corner of the attic while Mary worked through the letters with careful, respectful hands, and it was nearly an hour before she found it a letter addressed to Whitmore unsent, folded but never sealed, dated only 4 months before Eleanor's death. She read it twice before she trusted herself to read it aloud. "Dearest brother," she began, "I have thought carefully on your request, and I cannot in good conscience release funds held for Anna's future to cover debts of your own making. You know as well as I do that Father's estate has already been divided fairly between us, and what remains in trust belongs to my daughter alone. I will not be moved on this, however much you press me, and I would ask that you not raise the matter again for the sake of peace between us, if nothing else." Jonathan's face had gone pale in the dim attic light. She never sent it. Perhaps she said it to his face instead, Mary said. Or perhaps she meant to soften the words before sending them, and never found the courage before she took ill. Either way, Jonathan, this proves the refusal happened before her death. This proves Whitmore's motive existed long before he ever filed a custody claim dressed up as concern. "It's her handwriting," Jonathan said quietly, reaching for the letter with something like reverence. "God, it's really her handwriting." Mary let him hold it for a long moment, watching grief and vindication war across his face in equal measure before she spoke again, gently but firmly. "This is enough to bring to the second hearing," she said. "This is proof, not instinct. Whatever Whitmore's lawyer argues about slander, he cannot argue against his own sister's written words." The 2 weeks before the second hearing passed with a tension that settled over the household like humidity before a storm. Every small joy shadowed by the knowledge of what still hung unresolved. And it was during this uneasy stretch that Mary noticed something shifting in Jonathan that unsettled her more than Whitmore's countersuit ever could. He had begun in small ways to court her. Not obviously. Not with the desperate gestures he'd once thrown at Anna. No gifts. No grand declarations. Instead, small things, bringing her coffee before she asked for it, lingering a few extra minutes on the porch each evening after Anna had gone to bed, asking after her day with a genuine interest that had nothing to do with the household's stability and everything to do with her. "You're doing it again," Mary said one evening when he'd appeared beside her at the porch rail with 2 cups of tea. Neither of them had requested. "Doing what?" "Being kind in ways that have nothing to do with the arrangement we agreed to." "I didn't realize kindness required an itemized justification," Jonathan said. And there was a lightness in his voice Mary hadn't heard from him before, not once, not even in the calmest of their recent evenings. "You know what I mean, Jonathan." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands the way he did when choosing words carefully. "I told you I'd wait for you to work out what this was between us. I meant it. But waiting doesn't mean I have to pretend I don't already know what I feel." "And what do you feel?" Mary asked, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. Dreaded it because she suspected it would mirror something she'd been refusing to examine in her own chest for weeks now. "I feel grateful," Jonathan said. "And I feel something considerably less simple than grateful, which I won't name until you're ready to hear it, because I don't think you are yet. And I'd rather wait 100 more evenings than push you towards something before you're standing on solid ground." Mary looked out at the darkened fields, unable to hold his gaze, while her own heart argued with the careful boundaries she'd built around it. "Thomas has been gone less than 2 months, she said quietly. "I know. It feels disloyal, feeling anything at all this soon." "I understand that better than you might think," Jonathan said. "I buried Eleanor and spent 6 months feeling like a stranger in my own house, in my own grief, because I didn't know how to hold sadness and hope in the same 2 hands without one crushing the other." He paused. "But I've come to believe they can exist together, Mary. Grief doesn't ask permission to sit beside something new. It just does whether we're ready or not." Mary didn't answer that, but she didn't move away from him either, and the 2 of them stood together in comfortable, unresolved silence until the evening chill finally sent them both inside. The second hearing arrived with considerably more tension than the first. The courtroom fuller this time, word having spread through the county about the trust scandal and the unusual widow who'd married into the middle of it. And Mary felt every eye in the room as she took her seat beside Jonathan Eleanor's letter, folded carefully in her lap. Whitmore's lawyer opened aggressively, painting Mary's earlier testimony as reckless speculation dressed up as fact, designed to damage his client's reputation and secure custody through slander rather than truth. Mrs. Hale offered this court nothing but a guess, the lawyer said. A guess dressed in confident language, certainly, but a guess nonetheless. My client's request for funds made in a moment of private financial difficulty between siblings does not constitute the calculated scheme Mrs. Hale accused him of in open court. We ask that this court formally recognize the damage done to Mr. Whitmore's reputation and reconsider the custody arrangement in light of Mrs. Hale's demonstrated willingness to speak beyond the evidence. Judge Pruitt's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mary caught the faint tightening around his eyes that suggested he remembered quite clearly the pallor that had crossed Whitmore's face at the first hearing. "Mrs. Hale," the judge said, "do you have anything further to offer this court beyond what was presented previously?" Mary rose, Eleanor's letter in hand, and felt the entire courtroom's attention sharpen toward her. "Your Honor, at the previous hearing, I offered this court my read of a man's reaction, and I stand by that read, but I understand instinct alone cannot settle a matter of this weight. Since that hearing and going through the late Mrs. Hale's personal effects, we discovered a letter in her own hand dated 4 months before her death addressed to her brother. She read the letter aloud slowly, deliberately, letting every word land in the silent courtroom. And when she finished, she looked directly at Whitmore, whose face had gone the same pale color it had worn weeks before. "This letter was never sent," Mary continued. "We believe Eleanor Hale delivered this refusal to her brother in person. Instead, which would explain why he has no record to dispute only his own memory of a conversation he'd clearly hoped had died with her. This is not a guess. Your Honor, this is his own sister's written testimony made months before her death, months before any custody claim existed, proving beyond doubt that the debt and the refusal were real, and that Mr. Whitmore's motive for pursuing guardianship existed long before his stated concern for Anna's welfare ever surfaced." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Pruitt's gavel came down sharply to restore order. Whitmore's lawyer rose, visibly rattled. "Your Honor, the authenticity of this letter has not been established. I would be happy to have it examined by any handwriting expert the court trusts," Mary said calmly. "I would also invite Mr. Whitmore to explain under oath why his own sister would fabricate a private refusal to a request he now claims never carried the weight I've suggested." Whitmore said nothing. His silence in a courtroom that had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment spoke louder than any denial could have. Judge Pruitt studied the letter for a long moment, then looked up, his expression settling into something final and unyielding. "This court finds the letter credible on its face, and finds Mr. Whitmore's continued silence in the face of direct questioning further damaging to his position," the judge said. "This court reaffirms its previous ruling. Custody of Anna Hale remains with her father. Furthermore, given the pattern of financial motive now established across 2 hearings, this court will be forwarding the entirety of this matter to the county prosecutor for review of possible fraud in the handling of the trust request. Mr. Whitmore, I would strongly advise retaining separate counsel for that matter, as your current representation appears to have been arguing from a position considerably weaker than you led them to believe." The gavel came down final this time, and Whitmore rose without a word, his face a mask of controlled fury, and left the courtroom without so much as a glance toward Jonathan or Mary, his wife trailing behind him. Her earlier performed sympathy, nowhere in evidence, now replaced by something that looked to Mary's eye suspiciously like relief at finally being free of the whole affair. The ride home carried a different quality than the first, the tension of uncertainty replaced by something that felt for the first time since Mary had walked into that midnight cabin conversation weeks before, like genuine safety. "It's over," Jonathan said as though testing the words for truth. "Really over this time." "The custody matter is over," Mary said. "Whitmore's troubles with the prosecutor are only beginning, but that's a fight that belongs to him now, not to us." "You saved us twice," Jonathan said, "in front of the whole county twice." "I found a letter," Mary said. "Eleanor did the real work. She refused him months before any of this began, and she left proof of it behind without ever knowing how badly her daughter would need that proof someday. "She'd be grateful to you," Jonathan said quietly, "for finding it, for everything since." Mary didn't answer that directly. The weight of Eleanor's presence in the conversation settling strangely between them, a woman neither of them had ever properly grieved together, though both of them owed her, in different ways, more than words could easily carry. Anna's recovery continued steadily through the following weeks, and with the legal threat finally truly resolved, the household settled into something Mary hadn't quite dared hope for in the frantic early days of the arrangement. An ordinary rhythm day after day, unremarkable in the best possible way. It was on a quiet afternoon in the garden nearly 2 months after the second hearing that the moment finally came. Mary was sketching letters in the dirt as she'd done nearly every day since that first hesitant line, and Anna sat close beside her, now closer than she ever had in those early weeks, her small hand occasionally reaching to trace over the shapes Mary drew. "This one's tricky," Mary said, drawing a careful M. "Took me forever to learn as a girl. My hand always wanted to go the wrong direction." Anna traced the shape with her finger, slow and careful, and then without any warning at all, without any build-up, Mary could have predicted, even after weeks of watching for exactly this moment, she spoke. "M," Anna said. "For Mary." The word hung in the garden air like something too fragile to be real, and Mary froze completely, afraid that any reaction at all, any sudden movement or too loud response, might send the moment fleeing back into the silence it had emerged from. "That's right," Mary said, keeping her voice as steady and unremarkable as she could manage despite the roaring in her own chest. "M for Mary. You're exactly right, Anna." Anna looked up at her, then really looked, her small face open in a way Mary hadn't seen since the day she'd first arrived in this garden, and something passed between them that no words could have carried better than that single small syllable had. "Can you teach me the rest?" Anna asked, her voice rusty from disuse, but unmistakably wonderfully present. "All the letters, not just mine." Mary had to look away toward the roses for a moment, blinking hard before she trusted her voice enough to answer. "I would love nothing more," she said, "than to teach you every single one." She found Jonathan in his study that evening and told him what had happened, watching the news land on him like something physical, watching him sit down heavily in his chair as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him upright. "She spoke," he said. "She actually spoke. She asked me to teach her the alphabet," Mary said, and her own voice cracked slightly on the words, the weight of months of careful patient work, finally bearing fruit. "Jonathan," she called me by name. Jonathan pressed both hands over his face, and when he lowered them, his eyes were wet, unguarded entirely, without the careful composure he usually maintained. 6 months of silence, he said. 6 months, and then 2 more waiting for this. I didn't know if it would ever come. "I told you it was coming," Mary said gently. "I told you the day she cried behind that door." "You told me a great many true things I didn't fully believe until I saw them happen," Jonathan admitted. "I believe everything you tell me now, Mary. Every word of it." Something in the way he said it, quiet and complete, made Mary's chest tighten with a feeling she'd been holding at arm's length for weeks now, refusing to name it, refusing to let it settle into anything solid enough to require a decision. "Jonathan," she started, but he shook his head gently. "I'm not asking tonight," he said. "Tonight is Anna's. Whatever's between us can wait one more evening for its turn." Mary nodded, grateful for the reprieve, even as some part of her recognized that the space between them had grown too full to hold much longer that whatever careful walls she'd built around her own heart since the night of her hurried wedding had begun slowly and without her full permission to come down entirely. Anna's words came more frequently after that first breakthrough. Tentative at first, single words offered like small gifts, then short phrases, then gradually full sentences that carried the particular halting rhythm of a voice, relearning itself after long disuse. She did not call Mary mother. She never asked to, and Mary never pushed for it. holding fast to the promise she'd made that first midnight in her cabin. But she began unprompted to seek Mary out in ways that spoke louder than any title could have, climbing into her lap during evening readings, tugging her sleeve to show her some small discovery in the garden, once memorably falling asleep against her shoulder during a long carriage ride into town. Her small hand curled trustingly into the fabric of Mary's dress. Jonathan watched these small moments accumulate with an expression Mary had learned to recognize as something between gratitude and a longing. He was still carefully holding back for her sake. It was Anna herself, in the end, who finally forced the conversation. Neither adult had been brave enough to start. "Papa," she said one evening at supper, her voice still carrying that careful rebuilding quality, but growing steadier by the week. "Do you love Mary?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a great height, and Mary felt her fork freeze halfway to her mouth, watched Jonathan's composure crack entirely under the weight of his daughter's guileless directness. "That's a big question for supper," Jonathan managed finally. "Prudence says you look at her like Papa Hollis looks at Mrs. Hollis at church." Anna said, undeterred with the particular relentlessness children brought to questions adults desperately wished to avoid. "Do you?" Mary set her fork down carefully, her heart hammering, unable to look at either of them, and the silence stretched long enough that even Anna seemed to sense she'd asked something larger than she'd fully understood. "I think," Jonathan said finally, his voice rough but steady, "that's a question I should ask Mary directly rather than answer for her sake in front of you. Would that be all right, Anna?" Anna considered this with the grave seriousness only a child could bring to matters of the heart, then nodded and returned to her supper as though the matter were settled, leaving the two adults sitting in a silence considerably heavier than the one that had come before it. Later that night, once Anna had gone to bed, still humming faintly to herself, a habit that had crept back into her routine over recent weeks, small and off-key, and utterly wonderful to hear Jonathan found Mary on the porch, exactly where she always seemed to retreat when the weight of the day required processing. "I'm not going to pretend she didn't ask what she asked," he said. "No." Mary agreed. "I don't suppose either of us can pretend that." "Mary." He said her name carefully, the way a man might approach something he feared could shatter if handled wrong. "I have waited months to say what I'm about to say because I promised you time and I meant that promise. But I find I can't wait any longer without at least being honest about where I stand, even if you're not ready to stand there with me yet." Mary's hands tightened around the porch rail, her heart climbing into her throat. "I love you," Jonathan said simply. "Not the desperate love of a man who needed a shield the night we married. Something that grew slow, the way you told me trust had to grow with Anna one quiet evening at a time, until I looked up one day and realized it had become the truest thing in my life. I'm not asking you to say it back tonight. I'm only asking you to know it so that whatever you decide it with the truth sitting plainly in front of you, instead of hidden away where I thought it was safer to leave it." Mary stood very still, the autumn air cool against her skin. Thomas's memory sitting quietly in the back of her heart, where it would always live, not erased by this moment, but somehow impossibly making room beside it for something new. "I buried a man I loved 4 months ago," she said quietly. "I told myself I had nothing left to give anyone, that presence was all I had to offer, that love had already spent itself and wouldn't return." And now, Mary turned to face him fully, and the words came slowly, carefully, but with a certainty that surprised her, once she finally allowed herself to speak it. "Now I find I was wrong," she said. "I find that love doesn't ask permission to grow back any more than Anna's voice asked permission to return. It simply does in its own time, whether we've prepared ourselves for it or not." Jonathan didn't move, didn't reach for her, waiting with a patience Mary had watched him learn slowly over months of hard practice. "I love you too," Mary said finally, the words settling into the night air, with a weight that felt at last like relief rather than danger. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Somewhere between a line drawn in the dirt and a fever-dark night neither of us thought we'd survive whole. But it happened, Jonathan, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Jonathan crossed the porch in 2 steps and drew her into an embrace that carried none of the careful distance either of them had maintained since their hurried wedding morning, and Mary let herself be held fully without reservation for the first time since she'd walked into his life as a stranger with nothing left to lose. They stood like that a long while, the house quiet behind them. Anna asleep upstairs with her newly recovered voice and her slowly mending heart, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch, an owl called once into the night, the same sound Mary remembered from the night this whole strange, impossible arrangement had first begun. "There's still Whitmore's prosecution to face," Jonathan murmured against her hair. "Still the whole county's opinion to weather. This isn't finished, Mary." "No," Mary agreed. "But we'll face whatever comes the same way we've faced everything else since that midnight you knocked on my door. Together, and honestly, and without pretending to be anything we're not." The prosecutor's inquiry into Whitmore's handling of the trust moved slower than either of them expected, the way legal matters often did in a county with one overworked circuit court and a docket crowded with disputes far older than theirs. And through the early weeks of winter, Mary and Jonathan settled into the strange, quiet work of building a life around a fight that hadn't fully finished, even as the household itself had begun at last to feel like something worth calling home. Anna's voice grew stronger by the week, no longer the halting rebuilding thing it had been in the garden that first afternoon, but something closer to the ordinary chatter of a child who had simply been waiting all this time for someone patient enough to let her find her way back to it. She asked questions. Now endless questions, the kind that exhausted Prudence and delighted Mary in equal measure, and she had taken in recent weeks to following Mary through the house with a persistence that reminded Jonathan, he said once quietly, painfully, of the way she used to trail after Eleanor before everything had gone silent. "I don't say that to make you uncomfortable," he added quickly, watching Mary's face for any sign of retreat. "I say it because I think Eleanor would be glad. Not replaced. Glad." "I don't need you to reassure me on Eleanor's behalf," Mary said gently. "I've made my peace with loving in the shadow of someone else's memory, Jonathan. Thomas isn't erased by what's grown between us either. Grief and love aren't enemies. I learned that lesson slower than I'd like to admit, but I learned it." It was a Tuesday in late January when the letter arrived that would test every ounce of peace they'd built. Prudence brought it to the study with the same wary expression she'd worn the day the second hearing notice arrived, and Jonathan's hand stilled over his ledger the moment he recognized the county seal. "Read it," Mary said, standing close enough to see the words over his shoulder, no longer content to wait in doorways, while trouble announced itself to him alone. Jonathan's eyes moved down the page, and his expression shifted from wariness to something Mary couldn't immediately name, not relief exactly, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man absorbing news too large to process in a single breath. "The prosecutors found enough evidence to charge him," Jonathan said finally. "Whitmore. Formal fraud charges tied to the trust. Eleanor's letter combined with bank records showing he'd already begun quietly drawing against expected guardianship funds before the second hearing even concluded. He was already spending money he didn't have the right to," Mary said slowly. "Convinced himself he'd win the custody fight before it even started, apparently," Jonathan said. "Confident enough to borrow against it. The prosecutor says it's about as clear a case of intent as he's seen in years." "What happens now?" "Trial," Jonathan said. "In the spring, most likely. And considerably less sympathy from this county than he had a few months back, from what the prosecutor tells me. Word travels fast when a man's greed gets dressed up as family concern and then gets caught for what it really was." Mary felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying, not the immediate danger which had passed months before, but the lingering uncertainty of an unfinished fight, the small persistent fear that Whitmore might yet find some new angle, some fresh grievance to weaponize against the family they'd built. "It's not over," she said. "Not until the trial concludes. But it's closer to over than it's been since the night you knocked on my door." "Closer," Jonathan agreed, reaching for her hand. "I've learned to take closer as a gift this past year. I don't ask for finished anymore. Finished asks too much of a world this uncertain." "Yo," Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in Virginia, mud giving way gradually to green, and with it came the trial that would everyone hoped finally close the chapter Whitmore had opened the night he'd first ridden up their drive with his carefully rehearsed concern. The courtroom was fuller than either hearing had been the whole county, apparently eager to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had entertained them through a long winter. And Mary sat beside Jonathan, with Anna's small hand held tightly in her own, the child insisting with the particular stubbornness she'd grown into since finding her voice again that she be allowed to attend. "I want to see it end," Anna had said when Jonathan tried gently to suggest she stay home with Prudence. "I'm not scared of him anymore, Papa. I want to watch." Jonathan had looked to Mary silently asking whether this was wisdom or recklessness, and Mary had simply nodded. "She's earned the right to see her own story conclude," Mary said. "We won't hide her from truths she's already lived through." The trial itself moved with the particular grinding thoroughness of legal proceedings evidence presented methodically. Eleanor's letter entered formally into record and examined by a handwriting expert, who confirmed without doubt its authenticity. Bank records laid bare showing exactly the pattern of premature borrowing the prosecutor had promised. Whitmore's face throughout it all carried none of the confident bluster he'd worn at either previous hearing. He sat pale and diminished his once sympathetic wife, notably absent from the proceedings entirely. And when the jury finally returned after a brief deliberation, the verdict landed with an inevitability that surprised no one in the room. Guilty, on all counts, all. The judge's sentencing was swift restitution, a term of imprisonment, and a formal permanent severance of any legal claim to Anna's trust or guardianship, a final door closing on a threat that had shadowed their family since its very first hour. Anna, sitting between Mary and Jonathan, watched the proceedings with a solemnity that seemed older than her years. And when the gavel finally came down for the last time, she looked up at Mary with an expression Mary would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Is it really finished?" Anna asked. "All of it? He can't come back and try again?" "It's finished," Mary said, drawing the child close. "He can't come back, Anna. Not ever again. You're safe. Your papa's safe. This family is safe." Anna pressed her face into Mary's side, and Mary felt the small shoulders shake. Not with fear this time, but with something closer to release the last held breath of a year that had asked far too much of a child, far too young to carry it. What? The ride home that afternoon carried none of the tension of the previous journeys, only a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with something lighter, something that felt for the first time in over a year entirely unburdened. "I keep waiting for the next thing," Jonathan admitted as the house came into view. "Some new trouble to knock on our door in the middle of the night." "Maybe there won't be a next thing," Mary said. "Maybe we're simply allowed now to have an ordinary life. It feels strange to imagine, doesn't it? After everything." "Strange," Jonathan agreed, "but not unwelcome." They found Prudence waiting on the porch, and when she saw their faces, she didn't need to ask how the verdict had gone. She simply nodded satisfaction plain in every line of her weathered face, and went inside to see about supper, leaving the family to their moment on the porch steps. Anna ran off almost immediately to check on the barn cats. Her earlier solemnity dissolved into the ordinary business of being a child, with an afternoon free of court proceedings, and Mary watched her go with a fullness in her chest that she still sometimes found herself unprepared for. "She's going to be all right," Mary said. "Truly all right. I believe that now more than I've ever let myself believe it." "Because of you," Jonathan said. "Because of all of it," Mary corrected gently. "Because a father was brave enough to admit he needed help. Because a mother left behind proof of her love even after she was gone. Because a child was stronger than any of us gave her credit for, and simply needed time and patience to prove it." Jonathan took her hand, and they sat together on the porch steps as the afternoon light softened toward evening, the fields stretching gold and green beyond them, the house behind them finally truly quiet, in the particular way that only comes after a long storm has fully passed. It was nearly a month later, on an ordinary Sunday evening, with nothing more dramatic on the agenda than supper and an early bedtime, that Jonathan asked Mary to walk with him out toward the rose garden after Anna had gone up to bed. The roses had come back fuller that spring than Mary had seen them in the entire year since her arrival. And she wondered, as she often did lately, whether some things simply needed a full turn of seasons to remember how to bloom. "I've been thinking," Jonathan said, "about the vows we made that morning at the Reverend's house." "I remember them well enough," Mary said. "I don't promise love," I said. "I promise presence." "I've been thinking that promise has been more than fulfilled," Jonathan said. "And I find I want to make a different one now. Not instead of that first promise, but alongside it. A true one spoken with my whole heart this time, not desperation." Mary felt her breath catch, understanding where this was heading before he'd fully arrived there himself. "Jonathan, we're already married," he said, a small, wry smile touching his mouth. "I know that. This isn't a proposal in any legal sense. But I wanted to stand here in this garden where everything really began between us, where you first sat with my silent daughter and gave her space to find her way back to herself, and tell you plainly, without any shield or contract standing between us, that I love you. Not as a shield, not as an arrangement. As my wife, in every sense that word was ever meant to carry." Mary's eyes filled, unexpected and unashamed, and she found herself laughing softly through the tears, an overflow of a year's worth of careful restraint finally joyfully spilling over. "I do promise love." She said the words echoing back to that hurried morning ceremony, but transformed now, filled with everything that had grown between them since. "I promise it freely, Jonathan Hale, without reservation, without the careful distance I kept the first time I said these words in front of a reverend who barely knew either of our names." "Then I suppose," Jonathan said, drawing her close, "we've finally arrived at the marriage we were always meant to have. It just took the long way getting here." "The long way was worth it," Mary said. "Every difficult mile of it." Summer brought its own small revelations, the way seasons always seem to in a household that had learned hard-won to treasure ordinary joys as much as it once had to brace against extraordinary threats. Anna's schooling progressed beyond anything Mary had dared hope for in those early garden lessons. The child devouring books with the particular hunger of someone who had spent too long without words and now couldn't get enough of them. And it was on one particularly warm afternoon, the whole family gathered on the porch after supper, that Anna asked the question that would settle finally and completely the last unspoken uncertainty between them. "Mary," she said, looking up from the book she'd been reading aloud with increasing confidence, "would it be all right if I called you something else sometimes? Not all the time. Just sometimes." Mary's heart stilled. She had waited a full year for this moment, had promised herself repeatedly that she would never push for it, would let it come entirely on Anna's own terms, or not come at all. "You can call me whatever feels true to you," Mary said carefully. "There's no wrong answer here, Anna. Whatever you choose." Anna considered this with her familiar gravity, glancing briefly at her father, who nodded encouragingly, though his own eyes had gone suspiciously bright. "Mama," Anna said, finally testing the word, slowly, carefully, the way she'd once tested every returning word after her long silence. "Just sometimes. Is that all right?" Mary could not speak for a long moment, the weight of the word landing somewhere deep and tender in her chest, a place that had held Thomas's memory and her own private grief for so long that she'd nearly forgotten it had room left for anything new. "That's more than all right," she managed, finally drawing Anna into her arms. "That's everything, Anna. That's absolutely everything." Jonathan reached over and rested his hand gently on both their shoulders, and the three of them sat together on that porch as the summer evening deepened around them. No longer a father, desperate for a shield, no longer a widow with nothing left to offer but obligation, no longer a silent child waiting for the world to prove itself safe again. Simply a family, whole and hard-won, and entirely finally their own. Years later, when Anna had grown into a young woman with her mother's careful eyes and her stepmother's stubborn conviction, she would tell the story of that midnight knock at the cabin door to her own children, softening some of its harder edges with the particular grace time grants to old family legends, but always keeping the heart of it intact. She would tell them how a desperate man and a grieving widow had built something neither of them expected from nothing but necessity and courage. how a silent child had found her voice again, not through force or magic, but through the simple, unglamorous work of someone choosing day after day to stay. She would tell them that love did not always arrive wrapped in romance or moonlit declarations. Sometimes it arrived as a stranger at midnight, asking for help in the only language desperation knew how to speak. Sometimes it grew slowly in gardens and sick rooms and quiet porch evenings, built one small act of patience at a time, until one day it simply was undeniable and whole. And she would always end the story the same way, the way her father had told it to her once, when she was old enough to understand the whole of it, not with the courtroom victories, not with Whitmore's downfall, not even with the wedding vows finally spoken in truth in a garden full of roses. She would end it with the simple fact that mattered more than any of the rest. Mary Hale had promised presence, not love on a cold morning in a reverend's front room, a widow of a single day marrying a stranger out of nothing but conviction and courage. And she had kept every part of that promise until presence itself had grown into something far greater than either of them had ever dared to hope for. She had stayed. That was the whole of it in the end. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale. Just a woman who chose again and again through fear and fever and courtrooms and silence to remain exactly where she was needed most. And because she stayed, a broken family had found its way slowly and honestly back to being whole.